Hello, and welcome to another deep dive into a mythological woman. Today, Angela and I are really happy to be doing Medea. She is a very complicated woman, and yet she persists. Her stories have been told for over 2,000 years, and yet Medea is still popular in our culture. Most people who know very little about Greek mythology will know who Medea is. And we see the archetype of Medea, that woman who gets pilloried by society. We see it all around us. So let's dive into Medea. Um, Angela, so before we go into the invocation, Angela and I have been talking for a few hours now about Medea and, for the past several weeks. If you could talk about, like, if you had a one sentence explanation of who Medea is and what she represents, like, what might that be?
I can give a couple of sentences.
Okay, a couple's good.
I think that one of the reasons why she's so evocative is because she's not nice. That's not an adjective that you would ever attribute to Medea. But one of the things that I love about her is that when you're talking about power, especially regenerative power, you're talking about the forces of life, but also death, which operate on their own epic logic. And she embodies this really well.
Right. And I think that's so true because as a character, she is both the healer and the punisher.
Classic initiator qualities.
Classic initiation. And I think going into this discussion, kind of like just being aware that we live in a society that hyper emphasizes um, like creation, unrestricted growth, the sun always shining to make everything grow. And because we live in this landscape of ours, it can be really difficult for us to see the duality in characters like Medea. At the same time, I would say she's very alluring because
Mm-hmm.
she represents a part of us that we may have been like conditioned to deny, which is the shadow.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So,
We do
so
live in
much.
cultures where like light and darkness, they have to be separated and good and bad are separated. And that puts a lot of pressure on us. And Medea embodies that so well because her good and her light and her darkness are so huge.
Right, that she is so full of longing
Yeah.
that the two polarities in her are so strong. As always, when we do these classes, it comes with a bit of a warning. We talk about difficult subjects, including sexual aggression, violence, murder in this case, and also very difficult themes such as trauma, um, politics, religion. In our explorations, we kind of hit along a lot of really powerful areas. So be gentle with yourself as you go into this discussion with us. And hopefully, you'll be inspired to explore who Medea is to you. So let's begin. We have an invocation like we always do. So I will pop up the slideshow so we can read the invocation. So Angela chose this invocation, which is so beautiful, and Maria Callas, a goddess in her own right. I feel like we will definitely do a future episode on her. She deserves it. That's her as Medea. So that is our Medea invoking photograph. She just perfectly captures the essence of Medea. So relax if you're watching us and you can see the slide. Just take in all that Maria Callas is offering us in that photograph. All that energy, the longing, the desire, betrayal, all the things that she is managing to evoke It's the brilliance of that photo and Maria Callas. And now I'll read this little section from Medea's prayer to Hecate in Ovid's Metamorphoses. O night, faithful friend of mysteries, and you, golden stars and moon, who follow the fiery star of day, and you, Hecate, goddess with threefold head, you know my designs and come to strengthen my spells and magic arts, and you, earth, who offer your potent herbs to magi, and airs, winds, mountains, streams, and lakes, and all you woodland gods, and all you gods of the night, be present now. There's so much power in that. Be present now. Medea doesn't beg the divine or the spirits, she commands them. So I wanted to begin by referencing this book, Daughters of Hecate, which is a really great deep dive. If you are fascinated by women in magic, by witches in the ancient world, specifically the ancient Mediterranean, this is the book for you. It is on Kindle now. And I wanted us to see Medea as this beautiful woman, to help her or to restore her beauty. That whatever she did, she was gorgeous. And so let's read this passage from another telling of Jason's story in the Argonautica. Now soon as ever the maiden saw the light of dawn, with her hands she gathered up her golden tresses, which were floating round her shoulder in careless disarray, and bathed her tear-stained cheeks, and made her own skin shine with ointment sweet as nectar. And she donned a beautiful robe, fitted with well-bent clasps, and above her head, divinely fair, she threw a veil gleaming like silver. Because often in the art, you'll see in this kind of quite beautiful painting from the 19th century, Medea is depicted as really dark complected, dark haired, foreign, and we're going to be talking more about that. But in this telling of the story of Jason, she is beautiful and golden and fair, and very much kissed by her paternal lineage as being part of Helios's family, much in the same way that Circe in the older descriptions has the golden eyes and the golden hair and so on. And the dark hair, the dark looks, the foreign looks come later on in the art and the telling of her story. So Angela, we need to begin with a little bit, and I found this from this obscure website that I don't think has been updated since like 1995 or something, but on Medea's family tree. And you raised a really good point when we were talking earlier, that since we are talking about stories that began as an oral tradition and then started to be written down, that there are going to be different versions of them. And this is no different than today. We have like our popular myths today, like if you look at like the Marvel universe or something like that as being a popular myth today, there's many different versions of them. And really popular things like Harry Potter, they even have whole fandoms and fan fiction where there's different versions of this story. So it was no different 2,000 years ago. There were different versions of stories floating around. Do you want to talk a little bit about Medea's? So we've already said that she's a descendant of Helios, but talk a little bit about her parentage.
Sure. Yeah. So we're a literary culture, so we tend to like to go back to Harry Potter. We like to make this distinction between what's canon, like what did J.K. Rowling actually write, versus like fandom stuff. But in pre-literate cultures, we didn't really have this. And a lot of this, you know, obviously it's been written down since, but a lot of what was written down was orally passed for a really long time. and oral stories move around a lot, and they shift and they mutate based on the politics or the needs or the different followings of the people of the region. And so it's not really an issue, but one of the things that we have with mythic characters like Medea is that very often they have like different or conflicting parentage. Like one of the things that sticks a lot is that, she descends from Helios. This is really interesting because, as Cindy mentioned earlier, Circe descends from Helios. Sometimes Hecate also descends from Helios. So you have this big tradition of these queens of witchcraft, queens of the darkness, also like being children of the sun, which is a really interesting idea. In some of the stories, like for example, I think it was Diodonis's telling of Medea, she's descended from Aetes and Hecate. So Hecate in the story is a queen. And this is actually a really interesting version of Medea because the way that he tells it is that everybody in the family was really mean, like Circe, her sister, was mean, Hecate was mean, they were constantly murdering strangers. They were so mean. Aetes was mean, but Medea was distinctive because she was not that way. She was constantly helping strangers, which made her family feel like, ooh, this one doesn't belong. And that's how she kind of ends up going on this voyage with Jason. So this is just a kind of like a small preamble saying, like just even now as we begin, the story of Medea is a lot more complicated than, the one that tends to descend in popular culture and sort of harden into what we think she is.
So when I wrote Entering Hecate's Garden, after kind of looking at all of these different stories, oh, excuse me, I decided to, oh, excuse me, I decided to kind of retell Medea's story from her perspective. And, it's looking at her genealogy and this idea that she is at least part divine and at least, she's descended from Helios, like you said, this sun god. And that her and Medea, her and Circe and Hecate and other descendants of Helios that were very lunar. It's almost like the solar begat the lunar. And you and I talk a lot about the balance of the solar and the lunar.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting. And then, of course, in most of the versions, she is the sister of Circe. So sometimes she's the daughter of Hecate, sometimes not. I think there's one version, and I forget which one, where they're actually sisters. But
Yeah,
in
that's the Diodonis version. Yeah.
okay,
Is that right? Yeah, Diodorus, sorry.
Diodorus. Okay, so there's different versions of these stories, and take the one that resonates the most with you and see what value it has for you, and dive into whatever one you connect with. So that's a little bit about her family lineage. Because they were descended from Helios, they all had a little bit of the divine in them, and they were all magicians, or sorceresses. They all had this ability to cast spells and work with potions, and they were pharmaca. They worked with plant magic and plant medicine. So this whole family was very much about the practice of what we might call like natural magic today, and very involved with like the spirit of Hecate, in that, she is this liminal figure who also governs like the deeper world.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really glad there are some themes that you brought up that are worth touching upon. So to start with, yeah, there's a lot of like in the different stories, sometimes Medea is wholly a goddess and sometimes she seems wholly human. So there's this little conflict. There's also, she gets a lot of her healing capacities from Prometheus, who's, technically part of her family. And one of her sons that she has with Jason will later train with Chiron, like the wounded healer. So she has this really compelling lineage. And to return to this sort of like, it seems like a conflict, this idea that these goddesses that are lunar come from the sun. But actually in older cults of Apollo, who of course is exclusively associated with the sun today, it was understood that the sun comes from the underworld and returns to the underworld every night. In fact, there's one story where Apollo is actually making love to Persephone in the underworld, and that's where he actually procures all of his wisdom. So he was worshipped as an incubator god in some cults. This exclusive association of Apollo as the sun and the only source of rationality and logic, etc., comes from an Anatolian cult that syncretized Apollo with a hunting god, actually. And that's where you start to see this kind of divide, where the sun and the moon are separate things and kind of in opposition. So this is also just to say, totally work with the versions of the stories that you love the most, that resonate with you the most. But it's always interesting to hear even the tiny tidbits that don't make sense, that you can't make a connection with right now, because they're often betraying some older heritage of something that less resembles our culture now and might be interesting for cohesion when you're thinking about these goddesses and these gods.
So we thought we would work through the prologue from Entering Hecate's Garden, just to give us kind of a scaffolding for discussing the different myths around Medea, because I did a lot with the different myths that are out there about her and wrote it into this prologue as though Medea was introducing my book about pharmakeia, about this kind of holistic, magical, mysterious brand of herbalism that was really greatly kind of inspired by the story of Medea. And in the Argonautica, when in some versions of it, the place where Medea goes to help Jason, to do Jason a big fat favor, is Hecate's garden. And that's where the whole idea for the book came from. And that's why it felt important that the spirit of Medea be front and center in that book. And what I was trying to do with that book was to talk about witchcraft medicine in a more holistic way that kind of embraced the dark and the light, and was very much in the spirit of Medea and her sister Hecate. And in the book, I went with the idea that Hecate was their mother, at least their spiritual mother, if not their biological mother. So I'll start, Angela, and we'll just go back and forth between the slides. Everyone just get comfortable and settle in as we tell this story. There are many stories told about us. Few of them are true. You already know that, for you are one of us. This is not a new story for you, but a memory not long forgotten, now awakened. The plants of our mother called out, and you answered. Return with me now to her garden. Sit within her sacred grove and remember. In the beginning, there was only darkness and light. They bore a child who became our mother. With her first breath, she created the universe, and with her second, her children. She, in her infinite wisdom, made us of her, uniquely crafted so we could summon the spirits of the world she created for our use. Hecate knew that without challenges to temper our talents, we would quickly become restless. So she created the others so that we might learn from them. Their love and hate taught us the lessons necessary so we could transcend our weaknesses. They were the humans, and we were her witches.
Mother knows best, although we often fail to see this. She created me and my sister, and all the witches are our descendants. She taught us medicine to heal ourselves and others. This medicine did not merely ease our suffering, but offered us entrance into her mysteries. She desired us to understand pain so that we could experience joy. We acquired power through weakness and hope through despair. Our companions were her pharmakoikirios, the plant masters, whom we wove into our charms and spells. They protected us from the harms of the humans who feared us. We were and remain one with her plants. They are bane and blessing, the poison that heals.
Our ways were not welcome by those who feared our power. At their hands we suffered greatly. Through their words we were reviled. It is now time for you to remember the truth and cast aside their lies. We are rising. The men created their own gods, forever reminding Mother that she too must bear her burdens. These gods, made in the image of men, feared Mother. They sought to rob us of our rightful inheritance, that of the green world. Through their so-called civilization, they defiled the natural ways. But you already know this. Oh.
When I was young, I thought that I knew everything. I would not listen to Mother. She knew that my willfulness needed to be tempered through experience, so she did not interfere with my foolishness. Most likely, you have already learned this. Mother waits. She welcomes us into her sacred grove when we are ready. There are times when we rush into her garden without thought. Perhaps you, like me, have denigrated her treasures in order to please a man. This was my failure, or so it would appear if you believe the stories they tell about me. Truth be told, it was my necessary lesson. I had to learn not to give away my power to the unworthy.
Most of what you've heard has been twisted to make me the villain. This is a lie. Jason was a violent and greedy prince. I was heartbroken after all I had done to earn his affection. You see, I had raised his father from the dead, banished his enemies, and assured his power, only to be cast aside on his whim. What they tell you is that I killed my children. If I were to concern myself with the beliefs of humans, this is the only part of the story that would bother me. Look into your heart, for mine is within yours. You know I didn't murder them. They live on still as your angels and guides. I merely spared them the burdens of humanity. As for the serpent who guarded the oak, he has pulled my chariot across the starry road ever since.
My sister has always been stronger than me. You know her name, for she has returned to your world. Circe has spoken. We must all heed. Yes, I still can have my moments of pettiness when it comes to her. I languished with Jason while she flourished on her island. She would tell you how she suffered at the hands of men, the stories she spins of Odysseus, the web of deception he spun around her until she no longer knew her own name. Her son too lives on. I will say this of my sister, her medicine is that of revelation. She didn't turn men into pigs, they had always been so. Same thing for that maiden who was a monster in disguise.
There are those who have spoken ill of Mother over the centuries, the same sort who spun their false myths of me and Circe. They created their false religion to control us, and they sought only to destroy the medicine of the green world. They tortured and murdered her children. We were forced to protect ourselves. That time has passed. Now the time has come for you to remember the magic, the medicine, and the mystery. Return to Mother's garden. Medea.
That last line, return to Mother's garden, is also a wonderful inversion of the Garden of Eden.
Of what?
The Garden of Eden.
Yes, it is. And I was playing with all of that symbolism in the whole book, but I really wanted to try to evoke for the reader the spirit of connecting to something that was really ancient and archetypal, that herbalism, the way I teach it and experience it myself, has darkness and light in it. It has mystery, and it also has like kind of the more formal systems of learning. Like there's a lot to it. So two of the big themes for Medea that we're going to be touching upon are the idea of the shadow. And shadow work, shadow healing has become really quite popular these days, that a lot of people will talk about they're healing their shadow or they're doing shadow work. And going into this discussion, like when we go into Medea and start to explore who she is to us and how she wants to work on us, I think it's important to kind of build that network around it in understanding what the shadow is. So the shadow as a concept was really first advanced, as a psychological concept, I should say, was really first advanced by C.G. Jung And since his writing has been so influential, um, the shadow has become part of like what many of us see as a necessary part of our journey. But there is a lot of like reviling and pushing back against the shadow. That, you know, we need to kill the shadow, we need to silence the shadow, we need to bottle up the shadow, we need to do all these things to the shadow. And I'm just encouraging everyone who's with us on this journey through Medea is to not see the shadow that way, to not see Medea that way, to see the shadow as a necessary part and not to be killed and squashed and denigrated, but to be understood. And through understanding our shadow rather than hating on it, that is where the deeper healing comes from. And I think this is why so many people feel drawn to Medea.
Bless you.
Thank you. Because she is a figure that has such a strong shadow side. And even if we don't consciously become aware of that, there is something deeper within us that says, you know, like, yes, there is a call, like from the soul or the unconscious, that says, do this deeper work on yourself. Because Medea helps us heal aspects of ourselves that we find frightening or murderous or enraging, or the times that we've been trapped and made bad decisions. Like, she is a way into healing that within ourselves with kindness and acceptance, not trying to kill it off, but to learn from it and heal that way. So this is from a scholarly article about Medea, and it just kind of, so this is linking Medea, the Medea of Euripides, with the stories of the Old Testament, because I mean, we haven't talked too much about the Old Testament. Once in a while, we will hit upon Jesus and some saints, but you know, the books of the Old Testament and who they were written by and how they kind of correlate with what the Greeks were writing about during a similar time frame, basically. And both obviously are still hugely influential today. So this was, I wanted to kind of, I was really fascinated by this article, but the authors make a few good points. Who actually was the one who took the older version of Medea's story? And I think, Angela, you're going to talk about what the older stories were for a little bit. Who was the one who took the story where she does not kill the children, and turned her into this murderess? Like, and why was that done? And if you start to see this need to take the female lead of a story and make her quite terrifying and definitely not someone we would want to be. You also see this in the books of the Old Testament, some of the stories of the Old Testament. So there's parallels in the shifts that were happening in society where these older stories, where women were not so vilified, where they started to become vilified. And Euripides' Medea is kind of like one of the early examples of that shift. So you talk about this some of the time, which are these older stories, which I think are called like menstrual myths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So menstrual myths were this very old oral tradition where older women would pass them to younger women kind of on the cusp of menstruation to kind of explain the knowledge and the mysteries and the power that they were inheriting along with menstruation. These myths typically had like a format, right? There was an initiator, something that was representing the idea of healing and harming, so a very ambiguous character. There was usually something red or blood, like a fruit. For example, in Sleeping Beauty, she touches the spindle and she bleeds. And then there's typically a death followed by rebirth, which represents, you know, the arrival of womanhood. I'm sure you've already made this connection already. The Garden of Eden is actually an adaptation of a kind of menstrual myth. Over time, these stories got written down. There are a lot of theories about what happened with literary culture when we became writing based and how that changed our brains. But most of the time, these stories were written down by men who didn't always understand what the function of these stories were. So, for example, in the case of Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, these stories more resemble chivalric stories. Or in the case of the Garden of Eden, like this is like talking about the Old Testament, this is a very complicated thing. A lot of Old Testament stories come from polytheistic Sumerian mythology, but because of a bunch of traumas and a series of complicated political events, Judaism was becoming more and more hard monotheistic. And along with that, they were pushing down these traditions that they considered, negative or pagan. So polytheism, and also there came this very strong culture of denigrating women. Of course, in the Garden of Eden, you have a serpent. At that time, the idea of a devil as the ultimate opposition to God didn't really exist yet. So quite often when you're looking at saint stories or Bible stories, when somebody is talking about destroying serpents or defeating a dragon, they're talking about a really ancient symbolism that is tying the serpent to the feminine principle. I actually really like this passage that you've highlighted because it raises a couple of really interesting points. It talks about how there are many versions of the Medea story. Several of them don't involve her directly killing her children. The first one that's mentioned is from Eumelos, who says that she killed them by accident because she thought that they would become immortal if she buried them under Hera's temple. One of the big themes of the Medea story is sometimes she looks like a very powerful goddess and a very powerful agency-driven person in her own right. But on the other side of it, just like a lot of heroes that we've seen, like Achilles or like any number of heroes, she's manipulated by other gods. In her particular case, Hera, who has her own interests in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and also Aphrodite. And then there's this other story, I think it's from Creophilus, who says that the citizens of Corinth killed her children. The Euripides tradition, I mean, like, I don't want to trash Euripides too much because he had a particular function when he was, when he kind of positioned Medea as the killer of her children, which we'll definitely go into later. But one of the things that merits note is that at the end of that story, where she kills her children to get revenge, she then becomes immortal and is whisked away by a chariot that is operated by dragons. It's like pulled along into the sky by dragons. So many of our witchcraft stories, for better or for worse, come from the image of Medea. Like she's alluringly beautiful, but she can also be an old woman. She's associated with cauldron and with snakes, and she can also fly through the air on these dragons. And dragons are sort of beast master ideas of serpents. For example, the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, has like one last big fight with a dragon who's trying to eat a baby that hasn't been born yet. So that's hailing from a similar tradition.
Right, and we did Dracana and Medusa a few months ago. So if you want more on serpents and women, you can watch those because we talked a lot about that. So there's lots to dive into. I also wanted to stick with that article just for a bit and talk about the idea of longing in Medea and how we understand longing today. And I do think Medea is a spirit that may come to us when we are really feeling like a strong longing to be our authentic self, or there's a longing to break free out of a situation that wasn't what we thought it would be. I'll just read this passage. Medea aims at portraying the feminine aspect of the human condition. Medea, whose name means to know the wise advice, is the granddaughter of the sun god Helios and the greatest sorceress of Greek mythology. I do think Circe would probably argue that point. She is presented as someone who has access to advice from a supra-human dimension and can even conquer the powerful dragon. After the basic ethical principle of mutual love, not really in this case, there was some trickery involved, which makes married life happy, is disregarded and abolished by her spouse, she asserts her female rights and goes beyond the limits of what is morally acceptable. She even slaughters her own children and his mistress so that she can free herself and achieve all of her goals. I find this is so interesting because it's saying like Medea as a woman, like you said, she is sometimes portrayed as very powerful. And as a woman, she only had certain things available to her. And her vengeance against the other woman and the children, in order to get her revenge on Jason to upset him, it raises that question of what other choice did she possibly have? She's very powerful. There was a lot. There was a largeness to Medea. We're still talking about her all of these years later, right? And so in this largeness, she's a very large character. And she wasn't ever going to just accept Jason's terms and go off to a life of obscurity. That just wasn't for her. And we still see like women who make that choice today, that they want power. That still is something we struggle with, and there's a lot of pushback against. And women who use whatever the only means they have to survive, we still see all kinds of like problems with that in society today, where these women really get pilloried, right, in social media, from fat shaming to everything else that goes on by certain people. So, that dynamic of the woman who uses what's available to her advantage is still something that can really like elicit a huge backlash. That really hasn't changed.
Yeah.
She just wanted to be a happily married princess and ruling over an island and have her kids. She didn't want any of this. Jason brought it all on her. She just wanted, like when you look at the different versions of it, there is always that common theme, right? Like Medea wanted to be like, I want to be the wife of a powerful dude and have a nice house and my kids and be accepted and have girlfriends. And that's another thing that I think in this article and other ones talks about, like Medea's loneliness, like her longing for female companionship, and the way the women where she was with Jason were not that nice to her. So there's this whole aspect of her being othered and being foreign, and her being like, I just wanted to move to town and set up house and do, like, and have this kind of happy life with Jason. It did not go well.
Somebody in the chat was like, is that so much to ask?
Right? Is that so much to ask? This is all I wanted. And it's like, well, of course, and the whole thing gets started when she goes, when Jason comes to visit her dad, and he convinces her to do some magic on this dragon. Again, we're with the dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in Hecate, which Apollonius calls Hecate's garden in the Argonautica. So they're in Hecate's garden, the super enchanted grove, again, shades of the Garden of Eden. They're in this place. The two of them go in. There's a giant snake, serpent, dragon creature guarding the most sacred tree, which is the oak tree. And in that oak tree is this fancy sheepskin, the golden fleece that Jason needs because it's going to make him super powerful. And so she has to like enchant the dragon who guards it and basically steal it for him. So, like, word to the wise, if the person you are dating asks you to do something super sketchy, it's probably a red flag.
As a fun fact about the Golden Fleece story, though, I hope you're all familiar with the Golden Fleece story, because we're not going to retell it. We're just kind of assuming that you know. So like Medea's on this adventure with Jason to get the Golden Fleece. The last time I was in Greece, I was talking to a Greek taxi driver who evoked the story spontaneously. And we were talking about it in the context of what's happening in Ukraine and like Greece in the context of the EU, et cetera. And he said, actually, the Golden Fleece is a metaphor for grain that the Greeks were importing from from the Crimea region and also from Georgia, and in fact, Athens became so reliant on those imports of grain that over time, when Sparta noticed how reliant Athens was, they blocked the imports of grain into the city, and that was one of the reasons for Athens' collapse. So this is just to say, like, myths are not necessarily true, but they are stories about things that are happening all the time. There are a lot of things that sort of shape the forces of myths. But to return to the story of Medea, there are also so many things that are happening here, right? It is true that Greece was a patriarchy. A lot of these regions were already patriarchies. So we're seeing these things from the patriarchal perspective of the time. So yeah, there is this question of what options did she have? We're also a patriarchal culture, so we tend to also project backward in that way when looking at Medea, not only our sympathy for her, but also our horror for what she did, like cancel culture, the pillorying of women that happens online is also a legacy of this. But then there are, like, this is what's great about Greek myths as well. There are also so many other layers, right? Like there's the intervention of the other gods who have larger interests in these stories that are kind of manipulating all of these players, including Medea and her characteristics, in order to get what they want, and things don't go so well for Medea because of that. For example, Hera makes Jason fall in love with her because she has a beef with King Pelias, and she knows that if Medea and Jason get together, eventually Medea is going to create a situation where King Pelias dies. And the last thing is also, like, you know, we're flirting with Euripides. I know that we're getting there, but she's also this huge character that from the Greek perspective, like when these stories were being told, was not somebody who was intended to be related to. She was being used in order to express a larger story about what was happening in society. And so just like any other hero, like Heracles, etc., her bounties are epic and huge and sort of uncopyable, but also her brutalities are epic and huge and uncopyable, which is something that, you know, Euripides really gets across.
Right. So this is, you want to tell us about the photograph in this slide before we talk about the next point?
Sure, yeah. So this is a picture that I took a few weeks ago, actually, in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris. I've never seen a statue of Medea before, so I was really excited. It was carved in 1893 by Paul Gasque, and it's Medea and her children, but the statue itself, I think, is called Infanticide. It's really strange because I think that you have another one of these illustrations in the slideshow. There are all these pictures of Medea in this state. It looks like she's fleeing with her children, but the name of the art is always a reference to how she's going to kill them later. And that's also kind of like an interesting juxtaposition. You know what I mean?
It is. And just, you know, to go back into her story a little bit. So I think we've gotten to the point Medea was a beautiful maiden. She wanted love and a happy marriage and children. Jason came to town to visit her dad. The
She did him a
first
ton of favors.
She did him a ton of favors. Red flags should have gone up, but she was young and naive and wanted to be in love. And then there was some shit that happened with her brother, where she had to choose between Jason and her brother. She chose Jason. They left home. They left her homeland off to another place where Jason wanted to be the big boss, and so on. They're married for a few years. Jason does well for himself. Um, Jason is a power broker. He wants to marry up. Medea's not good enough anymore, so he wants to replace her with this other woman. And Medea, not having any other choices, kills the other woman and then kills the children. And to link it to what Angela was saying about how these are parables of what was going on in society at the time, the idea that Medea was a foreigner, and that, like you said, the golden fleece represented grain and access to grain, and the
Yeah,
foreigner's ability to open that up for the Greeks.
yeah,
But
she was from
then
that region. Yeah.
she was from that region. So, but then at the end of the story, or at least at Euripides' version of the story, it becomes like this merger of the foreign and the domestic is doomed for failure, because the foreign can't be trusted and the foreign will kill us in the end. So there's that element of xenophobia that's going on in at least Euripides' version of the story, that by killing her children, like she is bringing death to this, melting pot of the foreign and the domestic, and that's not going to work. And that, you need to find a better way, a better trading partner, basically, right? Like,
Yeah, she can't be trusted. And this is also quite a common theme in mythology, like the Amazons, it's repeated over and over. We don't know why exactly the Amazons were the worst and enemies of heroes, like that they're often positioned that way, but we know that they're women, they're powerful, they didn't especially need men. But the thing that's said over and over about them is that they're foreign.
right. So there's always this idea that the dangerous woman is foreign. I mean, it also works for uh, masculine archetypes too, right? Like there's an element to it. But typically with the foreign woman, she often comes with some exotic abilities, like sexual abilities or magical abilities, and is very often like the seductress or the temptress. But Medea, like, really is very low on that scale. She was more naive when Jason first came to town. Then, she did her machinations for sure, and her spells, and called upon Hecate to sort things out. But she wasn't necessarily so overtly in most of the versions, like trying to achieve power and glory.
No,
There's
yeah.
subtlety to Medea's story. And so this is a great book on Medea that was published in the 90s, but I checked and you can now get it on Kindle, although it's an academic book, so it's expensive. But it is a great series of essays, um, from scholars and researchers on the meaning of Medea. And it's edited by James Close, but also Sarah Illes Johnston, who has done a lot of work on Hecate, such as the Restless Dead book and Hecate Sotiera and other kind of classical articles. So I'm always a fan when I see that Sarah Illes Johnson is involved in something, because I know she has a true understanding of like the ancient mythology, the ancient practice, the ancient art. Like she has a broad understanding of how these figures were depicted. And this is just a great line that she writes in the introduction about like why Medea is so compelling. In confronting Medea, we confront our deepest feelings and realize that behind the delicate order we have sought to impose upon our world lurks chaos.
I love this.
It's so spot on, right? Because Medea just wanted to have this orderly world, and things spiraled out of control. She did all the things, so we haven't touched upon, like, with her father-in-law, he was having some trouble, health issues, and so into her cauldron he went, and he was completely like reborn. That, she was trying to do all the right things, to be the
Yeah.
good wife, to do all the right things that Jason wanted her to do. And still chaos came calling. So I think Medea as a spirit might also like visit us, or we may find ourselves really fascinated by her when we are also entertaining like the precarity of our own life. That if we, so I think this is why, not just Medea, but other so-called dark goddesses, a term which I don't like at all. That Medea, Circe, Hecate, the Morrigan, Kali, who we're doing in a few months, Inanna, who we're doing next month, that, like, that these figures, when they really kind of press on us with a lot of force, it's because we're in a place where we've also seen like the chaos. And I think they're really agents to help us heal from the chaos if we learn to embrace it. So, just a few snippets from this book. The big question this book tries to answer is, why is Medea still so popular today? Why has she not gone away after 2,000 years? Um, the book contains like an amazing treatment of all the ways, well, most of the ways I would say Medea was depicted by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and and in art and literature. That there's also the note, like you said earlier, sometimes Medea is portrayed as divine and sometimes as purely human. But I just want to say here, like Circe, Medea wasn't necessarily understood in a religious sense.
Hmm.
Like, so when we talk about like even Hecate and rituals involving Hecate at her ancient temple in modern day Turkey, or the rites of Eleusis for Persephone and Demeter, that's a very different understanding of a figure than Medea being a figure like Medusa in many sense. Like, so there, it wasn't, she wasn't a religious figure,
Yeah.
but she was a spirit that had a lot of popularity even then. And, so there's lots of different versions of her story. She's on vases, she's on frescoes. Like Medusa, she's on a lot of things, even in the ancient world.
Yeah. Yeah. But I like this sort of relationship that you're developing between Medea and chaos, because chaos is something that we fear, but it's neutral, but it can also like create a new cosmos, right? It can also explode everything. I think one of the difficulties of Medea, like when we're looking back at her, we're looking at her from this perspective of our culture, which is like light and darkness are separate things. Medea is a bad guy, so the one thing that we remember of her is infanticide. But when you're actually looking at the stories of Medea, she's a lot more complex, and if we were not looking at her from our perspective today, she's actually hero level in her own right, which is part of how Euripides was thinking about her. So for example, like she does tons of favors for Jason. She goes on to help Orpheus, she goes on to help Heracles, but she also has tons of weird adventures in her own right. So before she restores his father, there's this great story about when they arrive on Crete and they encounter a bronze giant called Talos. Fun side fact about Talos: the Greeks were super into the mythology of robotics. Hephaestus was a forger of robots. And so Talos was this giant robot who was designated to protect Crete. And just like as a weird digression, the phrase sardonic smile comes from Talos, because the way that he would destroy invaders would be like he would pick them up and he would squeeze them to death. And the people that he was most often picking up and squeezing were Sardinians who were trying to invade Crete. And like he would squeeze them and smile. And this is where the idea of the sardonic smile comes from. Anyway, Talos, really big, really scary. Nobody knows what to do with him, but being a robot, he has a vein of ichor that descends like from up the side of his neck into his head down to his ankle, and there's only one bolt holding it together. So Medea, like in classic hero style, she's so clever. She's like, I think that I know like what to do, and she tricks Talos. She tells him he's going to have immortality or something, but she pulls out the one bolt that is his weakness, and he bleeds his ichor onto the earth, and that's how he dies. Like, so imagine if we were looking at Medea from the perspective of a Heracles or something. Like, she's a totally different and much more dynamic character.
Right, because speaking of Heracles or Achilles, or these heroes, like, so, but Heracles in specific, the idea of killing family members, killing the people you love the most, is something that was not uncommon in these hero epics as well. Like,
Yeah.
so Heracles had to do his labors, like, so seeing her as the hero of this story, or the heroine, that it shifts the gaze when you start to compare her to these other characters, because you see like the way she's been interpreted. And this is another excerpt from this book that builds upon what you were just saying about, like, to see Medea as the hero of these stories is a kind of radical act of reaching kind of across centuries and centuries to the older story, because during the restoration and the Renaissance, they were still telling Medea's story and retelling their stories. There's ballets, there's operas, there's plays, there's all these things, right? It's like there's all this art. Like, it just doesn't stop. these retellings, and really into like the Victorian era and right to today, the retellings of the story of Jason and Medea, where almost always Medea is the anti-hero, she's the villain. She's not an anti-hero, she's a straight up villain. Where she's twisted into this form, and Jason is put on this pedestal, even though the story clearly contains him not being a good fella. That when the two are weighed, that she's the bad one, he's the good one. And
yeah, because he has to be the hero. It's his hero's journey.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this, okay, I want to talk about this.
What?
I want to talk about this etching for like 45 minutes, but we obviously don't have time. So this is an etching by Edward Burne-Jones from the early Victorian age. And this is Medea and Hypsipyle. And I think I got that right. Yeah, Hypsipyle. So Hypsipyle was the woman who had designs on Jason before that old Medea came to town.
This is sounding very Circe.
Right? So I was looking at this etching, I was like, well, who is who? So it says, so is this Hypsipyle? And this is Medea?
The thinker with the plans.
Right? Or is this Hypsipyle, who is not nearly as attractive as this figure? And that's why Jason left her. Anyway, so this is, I love looking at these etchings. They're so helpful. Anyway, so what kind of woman is, so we're going to go with, this is the very enchanting Medea. We don't know about her with her giant pomegranate. So what kind of woman casts such an enduring spell? Like, Jason left Hypsipyle but it didn't last. But we're still enchanted. So in this role, in the early days of the Golden Fleece story, she's the helper maiden, right? The sidekick. And we see that like in so many stories where there is the hero and then there is the sidekick that is female, especially nowadays when there's all these calls for movies and television to be more inclusive. So they'll like plop a female character in, and maybe she'll be a person of color too, just to kind of amplify the diversity. And so it's like thinking of Medea, early Medea, like she's that role, she's the helper maiden, and then things change.
Yeah, she's too big for that role.
She's too big for that role. She wants the Academy Award. So then Medea becomes a wrathful woman whose lust for vengeance kind of drives her to the unthinkable in our society. Now, this is an interesting side note. You and I talked about this earlier. And we've already touched upon kind of like what, like Euripides, Medea, and other versions of the story, how they were actually these parables for what was going on in the world. And we see this a lot, like we see satires and so on today. So it was a parable. And in the Medea book, it talks about, there's a whole essay on Medea as the founder of cities, which kind of again links to like, if we shift the gaze from being the male hero to the feminine hero, because of her actions, cities rose and fell. Which is really, like, think about that for a moment. So whole kingdoms rose and fell because of, for the most part, what she got up to with Jason, but also like the post-Jason stories about her as well. And to elevate her to that like many great heroes, she was the one who determined whether cities were born or cities fell, and really was a kingmaker, which really changes the gaze on understanding Medea.
Yeah, she's trying to, that's
descended.
yeah. I mean, That's a magnificent point, because no, that is a little known thing about Medea, right? Like she's tied to Thessaly, but also things that occur in Persia. You know, she kind of contributes to the founding of this like other world. So yeah, it's a very strong initiator quality. We should talk about Euripides soon and what he was trying to do with
Okay.
the Medea thing. Yeah.
All right. This is probably a good point to get into Euripides because this passage from that book, I think,
Uh,
really dives into Euripides in particular, although not condoning Medea's infanticide, forces us to empathize with her situation. Euripides and several other authors also said that Medea's passion for Jason, which led her to betray her father, kill her brother, and commit many other heinous deeds, was inflicted by the gods. You already kind of alluded to that a
mhm.
little bit, like us being caught up in much greater forces than our own lives. So, does this vindicate her? Okay, so now let's go. You launch into more about Euripides for us.
I will say vindication is one of like the more annoying things about our culture. Like we're always trying to look for sort of that like redemption story at the end of the hero's journey, right? So there have been a lot of modern retakes of the Medea story where it's kind of like she's an angry wife who murders her children. And I understand the relatability of those stories. Like there's a lot of value to those stories, like making Medea feel more human and more relatable to modern times. But at the time that Euripides was producing these plays, that was not the function of plays. Like people were not looking to identify with the main characters, the heroes of these stories, and notably Euripides makes a lot of women, in fact, the heroes of these stories. Are not designed to be relatable, right? Like they're designed to be what we were talking about earlier, bombastic. You know, the great things they do can't be touched. The terrible things they do can't be touched. And these stories were also designed to sort of express some larger issue with society at large. So at this time, Athens is a really rigid society. It's also changing in a lot of ways, you know, like a judiciary system is developing. And the thing that Euripides really hated, a lot of people really hated at this time, was the practice of sophistry. So sophists were sometimes these sorts of like teachers, these kind of like public discoursers. You can compare them to lawyers, politicians today, who were kind of shaping the future of Athens philosophically, but also politically, right? Like they were people of intellect that were talking all the time. And one of the issues that Athenians had at that time, which is an issue that we still have today, is they would sort of twist language to make it mean whatever they wanted, so that language and right and wrong and good and evil for the society became a kind of abstraction inside their hands as they rose in political and social power. And so what Euripides was actually trying to do was express the danger of sophistry. So in the story of Euripides, one thing that I really like that he does is, even though he kind of breaks away from other storytelling traditions where Medea doesn't kill her children, he does emphasize storytelling traditions where Jason is a jerk. Like he's super ambitious, he's really out there for himself, he's really invested in his own heroism. And so at the end of like all of their adventures, when Jason and Medea kind of like, after all the murders and everything, like settle in Corinth and have a bunch of babies, you know, like life is quiet, things are good. And it's actually mentioned in, is it Euripides' version? Like as Medea grows less attractive, Jason's eye starts to wander and it lands on the princess of Corinth. And the way that he tries to position leaving her is, I'm thinking about our kids. Like
Right, what's
our
best for the children.
yeah, exactly. Our kids will inherit the kingdom. Your position will also be improved because our kids will thrive. Thank you, Eliot, for verifying. Yes, it's Euripides. And So you have to see this as a good thing. You have to see me leaving you as a good thing. And Medea's big obsession, which resonates through Euripides and also other versions of the story, Diodorus also emphasizes this. She's really pissed about him breaking his vow. Like his whole story about like, this is for the betterment of our children is a really nice way for him to absolve himself without taking into account everything they've experienced together, what she personally has sacrificed for him, and also the promise that they've made as two people who are going to spend their lives together and raise these kids. He's kind of like, no, like, you just have to look at it this different way, which was classic sophistry. So when Euripides sort of changes the story to makes it so that she kills her children, or it's not even actually sure if he started that, but definitely other writers build on that. Like this is the story, Euripides' story that everybody else kind of runs with. The function there is actually to use the hero figure, like, great and brutal at the same time, of Medea to illustrate that words are not abstractions. Like words have direct impacts on human beings that are flesh and blood and that you love. They can actually hurt you. So when you break your vow, you're causing harm to me, you're causing harm to your family. And that is why she kills her children, to demonstrate that words are real. They're not a thing that you can just play with. And I know that there's like a lot of like, definitely if somebody got divorced today and killed their kids to make a point, like, don't do that. Nobody should do that. But Euripides was a playwright, and this was the function of these plays. And that was also how people were understanding them. They were understanding that these are heroes that are conveying a story about a societal problem that everybody knew about. And the problem of that time was this issue of sophistry and the sort of manipulation of words such that they didn't mean anything anymore. Even if people felt deep inside that they could hurt you, like it's sort of like it's a story about gaslighting, actually.
100%, and false news and blind ambition, and how
Yeah.
the powerful, like in this case, Jason, and just like not just the gaslighting, but the outright like abuse and manipulation for the less powerful, which is a theme we're going to carry on, I think, with for a bit. So thank you for that. And the other thing is to remember when these plays were performed, they were entertainment, and they like almost like some of our late night television shows are today. They are entertaining, but they are a political commentary.
Yeah, sort of sardonic, like
Yeah.
Talos.
Okay, so now moving forward to what like Dr. Illis Johnson's continued kind of exploration of why Medea endures. So here, I think we've already touched on this kind of like the civil disobedience and all of that business. Dr. Johnson says, Euripides' Medea has come to symbolize the freedom fighter, celebrating the right of the oppressed to fight back with whatever weapons they have. MacDonald, who's the author of one of the essays, reviews the numerous dramatizations of Medea that has been offered in recent years, and goes on to explore two contemporary versions in greater detail than we can here today. And then, she kind of like talks about the way the relationship between the Irish and the English, like Irish being Medea, the English being Jason, like how this story is always being told both in very interpersonal relationships, but also like on the grander scale.
Yeah, which is in keeping with that tradition. Yeah.
And this passage, I think this is the last quote from this book. So the last two slides are these amazing quilts, modern quilts by this artist named Marilyn Belford, and they're so evocative. But so I wanted to finish with this quote, and I think I'll just read it verbatim. It is no longer possible to sanction rules that once divided men from women, civilized nations from uncivilized, blacks from whites, or any other group from another, as previous societies did, nor is it any longer possible to pretend that terrible crimes do not take place in average towns among seemingly normal people. For better or for worse, we live in a world where there seems to be no limits. Perhaps this is why Medea continues to challenge our imaginations. Like our neighbors, our colleagues, and the more distant people whom the news media bring to our attention each day, she evokes both our pity and our fear, our admiration and our horror. And I would add, and like she is us in many ways. You know, if we look at the greater power dynamics, and we're going to be talking more about that in a few minutes, that when the oppressed try to break free, even if it all started off sounding like a good deal, and then things go wrong, when the oppressed try to break free, there will be blood and there will be sacrifices. You know, it's never written anywhere that Medea was happy to murder her children or that she was happy with what she did. There is always that big sorrow associated with Medea, which I think she also offers us a way to deal with our own grief and loss. And I think the energy there is, I think there's a lot of potency for her there too. So of course we've been talking a lot about Euripides' Medea. Here's an infographic I made a long time ago, which is, it kind of sums up what happened to Medea and how she went from being that Kore, that maiden, naive figure trying to help, to this. By the mistress I worship most of all, and have chosen as my helpmate, Hecate, dwelling in the innermost recesses of my hearth, no one will bruise and batter my heart and get away with it. So that vengeance, I mean, we've all felt that. So Medea and Hecate together, I'm kind of like, I'm always enchanted by these ancient illustrations. So this is by Renee Boivin from the 16th century. And there's Hecate, triple-headed Hecate. And Medea is making her potions in the foreground. So, you know, she endures, like as a character, through the Middle Ages and so on. So we've talked a lot about Euripides. Maybe we'll just end with this, but you know, Euripides is writing from the female perspective, and like you said, but also the perspective of anyone manipulated by the power structure, by the politicians of the day with their fake news, and they never mean what they say, and they're only looking out for themselves, so don't believe them. But the end of this quote is, but we must fix our gaze on one person only. Men say that we live a life free from danger at home while they fight with a spear. How wrong they are. I would rather stand 3 times with a shield in battle than give birth once. So it's this whole idea that the hero is the one out fighting fighting the good fight, and the woman who's at home giving birth, she's not making the same contributions to society. So I really like how Euripides gives that shout out to, in some ways, you know, it's complicated with how he treats Medea, but a lot of what Euripides says is really kind of elevating the feminine, even if he is using it as metaphor for, in general, anybody who the powerful kind of step on their necks, right? I think we've covered all of this. I just really like this. This is Sarah Bernhardt as Medea. With the other woman.
Glauce.
Yes. And we've touched upon kind of some of the different versions, and some of you talked a little bit about Sisyphus. So I think we've covered everything. Modern Medeas, we need to finish up with modern Medeas. So this is a fairly modern retelling of Medea, which it's really kind of etheric, this book. So Christa Wolf is a German author. And this has been around for a long time. And I just grabbed a couple of things. Margaret Atwood wrote the introduction to this translation, and I love what she says. Like a tunnel full of mirrors, it both reflects and echoes. The question it asks the reader, through many voices and in many different ways, is what would you be willing to believe, to accept, to conceal, to do, to save your own skin, or to simply stay close to power? Who would you be willing to sacrifice? And, from another perspective, it's like, what parts of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice to gain some power, get some footing in this world, right? What are we always being asked to sacrifice, and will we do it? And this is how the book ends. Where can I go? Is it possible to imagine a world, a time where I would have a place? There's no one I could ask. And that's the answer. And I think, at least for me personally, in exploring why I find Medea so fascinating, I kind of like built a whole book around her story. That it's this Medea never seemed to find a place where she belonged in the world, but that's all she wanted. And personally, I can really relate to that experience of, never feeling like I do now. But for a big part of my earlier life, I kind of felt like Medea, and that I didn't know where I fit in. And that I was kind of being seen a certain way, which wasn't accurate. And, and then also related to, I guess, like trauma and so on growing up. But this thing like Medea not having a place in the world. And even if you look at like the post Jason Medea canon, that, she never finds her place in the world. Whereas her sister Circe had her place in the world.
Alone.
Alone.
On an island. Yeah.
So it's almost like, like Circe the introvert, Medea the extrovert, you know what I mean? Like it's that balance that these are two very closely attuned figures, but Circe is out and Circe is home. She's introverted, she's in the inside, and Medea is like out in the world, really trying to find her way in the world, where Circe was just sent to an island and stayed there. And both being children of Helios, the two different aspects, I think they're really powerful.
Yeah, they can't be hidden. I love what you're saying. It resonates so much with me because even if like, for example, I also come from a really traumatic background, but I was like really trained to sort of like fall in line and do whatever is necessary and, all of those things. And I think even if you feel like you can incorporate yourself well and sort of like read the room well, there's always a part of you that's worried about your inner Medea. Like, it's just a matter of time before people like find out. And what if they find how I really feel and who I really am, and I'm a monster, like that will be the overall consensus. There's this huge anxiety about that Medea that we keep inside us.
For sure. Okay, so got a couple of more slides. So the Medea play, there are still like world-class level productions of the play going on all around the world. This is one with the great Helen McCrory, and the retelling of it, like, like what Euripides did so well, and that productions of the play can do, is that what is really shocking about Medea is that she's a sorceress, she's got her things, but she's also very kind of normal until things fall apart. So I think that's a point, but also, just to Google and spend some time, there are videos on YouTube of this production, and that's another way to connect to the spirit of Medea and ask yourself, why are you drawn to her? Why are you repulsed by her? There's also this movie and book called Gone Girl. I think that's really popular. So if that's a book or a movie that you really like, I mean, you can see the main character there as a Medea figure. And then, so we have slides for this. It's like we have slides for this because it still feels hot. So, And so when this trial between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp was going on, I was you and I were getting ready to do the Medusa class, and we talked about, is she Medusa? And I'm like, well, no, she's not entirely innocent. She's more of a Medea character, because
Yeah,
Medea
she's
did do some
complicated.
things,
Yeah.
right? And maybe was a gold digger, or maybe like trying to move up in the world, or maybe she just really loved him. All of this
She doesn't have a
ambiguity,
perfect victim halo. Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And that and we can imagine that, like, pre this debacle with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, like how we almost may have seen her and how she was portrayed. I think she was in some superhero movie.
Aquaman.
Yeah, so like that wise maiden helper character. Um, and then this happens, and I would really argue that she's been Medea'd, like you were making it a verb, by society. That clearly, like, I'm not saying she's innocent, and I'm not saying, I'm certainly not on either of their side. I want no part of picking sides in that mess. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, but the way the incredible, like, social media backlash against Amber Heard, and how Johnny Depp became this hero, completely expunged of any wrongdoing, when the evidence clearly shows that neither of them are innocent. They both got up to some very toxic
Yeah, it
and
was a pretty
troubling things.
toxic relationship. Yeah.
A very toxic relationship between the two of them. But like, just when this was happening, at first I was like, I don't understand. Like, I'm no fan of Amber Heard, but I don't understand the level of vitriol being dumped on her. And now that it's kind of a few months after, it's like, oh yeah, this is like when people engage with the Medea story and they have that need to really pillory her. It's the same thing. And it's about some kind of, like, I would say, an internal drive to deny the fact that uh, either this could happen to them, it has happened to them, or there are manipulative, scheming things at work in their own shadow cells, and just kind of the general societal thing where, if we have to choose between a white, heroic, straight guy figure and a woman or anybody else, the anybody else is always going to lose. And, like I joked to you earlier, Johnny Depp even made a bunch of movies where he's
Mhm.
sailing around doing heroic shit, like Jason and his Argonauts, except these were pirates. So there's this whole thing about, and again, I am not saying Amber Heard didn't do anything wrong. I'm just saying this, like, if you look at this from a broader lens, what is she eliciting within us when we need to hate her? And what kind of, like, as a society, why do we have a need to, like, really kind of just like nail her to the cross over this and abscond him of any wrongdoing? It's really fascinating, right? Like, because these archetypal stories, um, from this kind of deeper perspective of understanding that Medea is an archetype of something deeper and more mysterious that we can't quite grasp as humans, um, but that there are these forces that are like themes that, as humans, like, we are always grappling with them, and we can get very caught up in them in a personal level. And then, like, celebrities, and certainly celebrities are like, the modern almost divinities, or like the characters in Euripides' plays. Like, we elevate these people, we put their face on mugs and candles and stuff, no different than the Greeks and Romans did.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then why is that? Why do we need to, like, do that to Amber Heard?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Stephen made a great point in the chat while you were speaking about how he also feels like Johnny Depp got Jasoned. And I think that what was really great about the Greek tradition, like regardless of all of the issues with the society and all of those things, was these hero figures and also the god figures. They weren't perfect, and sometimes they did amazingly great things, and sometimes they did really horrible things. and they were all designed to kind of express to you how archetypes interact with each other, and kind of like just the nuanced neutrality and complexity of life, various different stakes of life, and how it's really, really complicated. But I think that one of the things that we discount, even if we don't consider ourselves like hailing from the Judeo-Christian tradition, is that our societies do, and our sort of cultural formatting does. And it's extremely moral, it's extremely sort of like one side is right and one is wrong, and there's no complexity here. You're not allowed to have complexity. Otherwise, you're going to get sort of shot down in the middle of trying to make a case for complexity, especially on social media. And I think that this is such a really good example of that, where like, as the story of this trial happened, and also as we get further away from it, you've got this audience in the public's face sort of like swaying back and forth like the Greek chorus, like looking for the villain and looking for the hero, but unable to just be with the discomfort of the complexity. And I think that's really interesting. And I love what you said about how, yeah, we have this huge outsized tendency, especially where there's like a woman involved who's not a perfect victim, to regardless of what you think she did or didn't do, like to make it so that she is like persona non grata in the entire shared social media universe. Like I think we've discussed this before. When I was running my company, one of the hardest things that I had to deal with, like while we were fighting our diversity fights, etc., was dealing with the fact that I was realizing I was harder on women and my expectations were harder on women, because like I just cut guys a little bit of extra slack for whatever reason. And dealing with that was really terrible for me, so we just have this, and being conscious of it, I think really changes the way that we might interact with these very public sort of peccadillos, because we're constantly being forced to like put out an opinion and make sure it's the absolute right one.
Definitely. And this whole need, like, I do think it's a real thing that I mean, obviously, this is a generalization, and it might be something that we or other people do on the individual level. But I would also think that there is this bias in society that when the woman isn't perfect, she gets picked on more than a man who is imperfect. I do think that's a legitimate thing. I'm not saying it happens all the time in all the cases, but I do think that as a society we tend to give men more mercy. White men, just to be clear, straight white men in particular, get a lot of our mercy. Um, so that kind of like leads us to what I would say is like a larger societal issue, which is always blaming women, that it's the woman's fault, even when things are done to them out of their hands, which, if we use the version of Medea where she does a lot of her trickery, kills her brother, does all this stuff because Jason kind of urges her to. And like you said, to the ancient Greeks, they weren't trying to like necessarily, the idea wasn't like to pick a winner out of this, but because a lot of how we see the world is like, you must be a winner and someone must be the winner and someone must be a loser and someone needs to be the good guy and someone needs to be the bad guy, that in this story and in a lot of other stories, that it's always the woman's fault. Like if the woman is not completely virginal, has never left home, has never so much as like drank a glass of wine, or even if she's like, then whatever it is, there's always something. And this is a real hot button issue because it plays out in the policies that govern our lives.
Certainly.
And nowhere is there a better example of how dangerous this can be, this need that it's always the woman's fault, than in the overturning of Roe versus Wade, this past, that happened a couple of months ago. And I've listened to, I don't know if we haven't talked about this, I don't know if you've listened to these impassioned speeches given by teenage girls at different places in the United States, talking about, like, how do you get to control my body? Like, how do you get to control my life? And the thing that whatever was done to the woman, or whatever choice she made, she has to bear the consequences of an unwanted pregnancy.
Or she's a killer.
Or she's a killer, right?
Yeah.
That she's killing her baby. And I hope, this is a hot button issue. But sometimes when we're deeply involved in an issue like this and trying to make some restoration of basic human rights, that women have the right to have abortions, that if we can take a moment, and it's the Aquarius full moon, and to try to gain some perspective and be like, oh, there is a bigger thing at work here that has always been at work in society. It's that women who have things done to them, or want to choose to somehow violate what some people view as the ideal of womanhood, that they deserve to be punished. And also this whole thing about, like, motherhood as the ideal, and if you don't want to be a mother, well, you're basically like killing your unborn children. Even women who choose not to have children, like, you don't have any children, there's like this whole thing about women and children, and that we should always want to have them. Even if we were raped, we should still want to have them, or if we were 12 and we were impregnated, like all of this weird thing that a certain segment of the society, like, tries to push on us. And I'm going to turn the slides off now, but you're going to bring in a really interesting book that kind of offers a perspective on this.
Yeah. So for people who are interested in this particular topic, I'm really glad that you raised the topic of Roe versus Wade. There's a great book by Sylvia Federici called Caliban and the Witch. And it's basically her thesis on how capitalism was designed. And it's based on this idea of what's called primitive accumulation. So capitalism sort of sustains itself by constantly sort of like seizing land and seizing rights from people so that other people believe that capitalism is working. But in the Middle Ages, when the witch trials were happening in Europe, it was also the time when capitalism was being constructed. So these things kind of intersected, like the idea of what the devil was hardened in order to make it easier to identify and prosecute witches. And the characteristics of witches were really tied to these unfavorable qualities that, in order to sort of like build the foundation for capitalism, had become a problem. So women were being pulled out of the workforce. So prostitution rose, and then rape was legalized to make prostitution not a thing anymore. This idea of expanding the population for the wealth of a nation became really popular. So abortifacients and contraception were labeled maleficium, so devil-driven sorcery. And you have all of these kinds of interesting and terrible effects that were not the case before, that relate directly to, one, how we define witches, how we define evil, and also like how we define statehood, which is really tied to this idea of subjugation of minorities, and particularly women as regards their reproductive capacity. And Sylvia Federici's argument was, because Marx felt that capitalism just does this once, like as a transitional period, and then it kind of just goes on its own, and then maybe we can have like workers' paradise later. Sylvia Federici's argument was, no, actually it has to engage in this over and over and over. It has to derobe us of rights over and over and over, which is definitely something that we're seeing. I mean, it's not an accident that in the particular case of Roe versus Wade, it's happening in the US, which is also the only industrialized country that has no maternal leave, and also has one of the highest infant mortality rates of all OECD nations, which kind of conveys the sense that it's not super concerned about children specifically. It's more about control of the reproductive element, which kind of goes hand in hand with capitalism from a systems theory perspective. But yeah, to bring this all back to Medea, all of this irrational stuff kind of holds together in our culture because of stories we tell and sort of like senses and feelings that we have about types of people and groups of people because of the myths that we convey and the way that we convey them, which ties back to the story of Medea.
And on that note, we welcome you to explore Medea and find a way into her complicated history and ask yourself what she means to you and why does she fascinate you or repulse you. So thank you so much for watching. Take a break, light your candle, and work. Just allow Medea to find her ways to help you heal into your own wholeness, because I do think she is ultimately a very, very healing and empowering figure. Thanks so much for watching.